Thank you so much for joining us tonight for this webinar, Amazing Megapodes, Evolution of a Mallee Mound Mover. I'd just like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today. I pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge and respect their deep spiritual and cultural connection to country. And I also pay my respects to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islanders here joining us tonight. So I'll just start with a few introductions. I'm Sylvia Clark. I'm the Senior Project Officer for Citizen Science and Community Engagement with the Murraylands and Riverland Landscape Board. And with us tonight, we have Dr. Phoebe McInerney. And Phoebe completed a PhD in 2023, looking at the evolution and morphological adaptations of birds, looking at both extinct species from fossils and also living birds. Since then, she's been working in natural resource management and community engagement, and currently works with Department of Environment and Water, organising events in national parks. So thank you, Phoebe, for joining us tonight. And we also have Dr. Craig Gillespie. Craig works for the Murraylands and Riverland Landscape Board. He has been working with us for the last 13 or so years, and he has spent a lifetime watching birds and investigating, learning more about their habits and the habitats that they live in. He's currently working at improving health and function of ecosystems by influencing landscape-wide processes to conserve native species systematically rather than individually. And we also have Chris Fulton. Chris, do you want to give a wave? Chris has recently joined us as the Community Engagement Officer with the Murraylands and Riverland Landscape Board after a long stint with the South Australian Arid Lands Landscape Board in a similar role. And Craig's job with us is looking after volunteer support, and this includes the malleefowl volunteers as well. And we have Alice Woodward. Alice, you want to give a wave? Alice is our wonderful Citizen Science Project Officer, and she'll be helping us out in the background. So the program will go with Phoebe starting to talk about the evolution of megapodes, the group of birds that malleefowl fit into, and then we'll have a bit of question time. And then Craig will talk about malleefowl monitoring in the Murraylands and Riverland and what we've learnt from that. And then question time after that. And then Chris will give us a little bit of a rundown on the volunteer opportunities that we have currently with our board with malleefowl. And then we hope to finish up around 8 o'clock tonight. So just a bit of housekeeping. We will be recording this webinar and we'll also be sharing it. We had quite a few people registered who weren't actually able to join us, so they'll be watching it later as a recording, and we'll also be sharing this more widely, and we'll be emailing it to you as well as a link, so you're welcome to share that more widely as well. So we ask while the presentation's on for you to turn your cameras off and also your microphones. If you do forget, Alice is able to mute you. There will be time for questions, like I said. If you can please pop your questions into the chat function, which should be up the top, usually the little speech bubble icon. Please put your questions in the chat, and then Alice and I will go through them in the question times. If there's extra time and you think up a question towards the end, we can all put our cameras on and just have a chat like that as well. And I really hope you enjoy this presentation. So that's all from me, and I'll hand over to Phoebe.
Wonderful. I'll just bring up my slides. All right, here we go. So thanks for joining us tonight, everyone. My name is Phoebe, and although I work for the National Parks and Wildlife Service now, or the Department for Environment and Water, in a past life, I did a PhD in avian evolutionary biology, where I looked at how birds evolve and change over time. And one of the groups of birds that I looked at included the megapodes. So that's why I know a little bit about them and why I've done a bit of work on them in the past. So today I'm going to be talking to you about the evolution of the megapodes. And of course, one of the best things about megapodes is that they are a bird. Not that I'm biased at all, but birds are pretty wonderful. And the evolution of birds is fairly complicated because they are a huge radiation. But down the bottom of this image, you can see something called the KPG boundary. And this is the border between the Cretaceous and the Paleogene, and the point at which the non-avian dinosaurs, so the non-bird dinosaurs, went extinct. So we can see that some of our main bird lineages were already occurring or had already started to diverge before the non-avian dinosaurs went extinct. But then after this point, we get a huge radiation of species coming out from there. And then again, the same thing happens at the Paleogene-Neogene boundary, where we get another massive radiation and we start to see the species that we know well today. I'll write down the bottom here in the dark purple red colour is number 2. And this is the important group for what we're looking at today, because this is the Galloansers. And if we just collapse that a little bit, you can see that the Galloansers are the second oldest lineage. So they're quite old within the entirety of living birds. And they comprise 2 main groups, the Galliforms and the Anseriforms. And Galliforms include chickens, quails, typical landfowl, as well as the Megapodes. And then the Anseriforms are your waterfowl, so ducks, geese, the Australian magpie goose, as well as these weird birds, the one in the middle there, which is called the horned screamer. It is a great bird. Would recommend looking it up if you're interested. So there's a lot going on here. There's a lot of different groups of birds, but the main takeaway point is that Megapodes sit within this group here, which is the Galliforms. And it can be a little bit confusing because they're quite a diverse group, and often they look like other birds that are completely unrelated. So for example, on the right, we have the orange-footed scrubfowl, and this looks, superficially quite similar to the black-tailed native hen or the lyrebird, but they're really quite unrelated birds. They're very separate on the avian tree of life. So this is a tree which comprises all of the landfowl, and because we're interested in the Megapodes, they are this group right down the bottom here. So they are the first group of landfowl which diverged. So they're the oldest lineage, and they probably also diverged around just before the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary. So the first ancestor of all Megapodes potentially existed before the non-avian dinosaurs went extinct as well. So this is a really long time period that we're looking at in the evolution of this group. However, we don't know a lot about this time period because the oldest definitive megapode fossil that we have doesn't actually turn up until the 24 to 26 million year ago time period in the late Oligocene. And this fossil is called Nullipodius minya, and it's a really small megapode which is forest adapted, and it was found in central Australia. So that means that we have a really long time period of tens of millions of years that we're not sure what's happening to this lineage, because all of the landfowl, so most of this radiation, is considered to have originated in Europe or across the Northern Hemisphere. So we don't even know at which point in time the Megapodes turned up in Australia. But what we do know is that since they turned up in Australia, they have radiated out and they now exist across Australia, as well as across the central Indo-Pacific and Australasian region. And unfortunately, this was one of the better maps I could find, although it doesn't actually include all of the megapode species in there. So there are more species that aren't covered in this map, but it gives a good idea of their general distribution across this region and their enjoyment of inhabiting really small islands. So megapodes dispersed throughout the Indo-Pacific as Australia moved closer to Asia about 10 or so million years ago. And that's when we start to see this real diversification and the evolution of the species that we know today. Now, this map here only shows the genus Megapodes, and I want you to keep that genus in mind because we'll come back to that later. But what this map shows is that megapodes didn't just disperse out of Australia once to inhabit these islands, but even within a single genus, there's multiple times that these birds are leaving Australia and starting to inhabit these new islands. And although many of them likely survived for millions of years on some of these islands, many species are thought to have gone extinct. We do have a fossil record of extinct species across this region, and most of the species that are still living, considering they're on really small islands and in coastal areas, they're threatened still, facing current issues like being targeted for their eggs as a food source, and especially being threatened by sea level rise, as some of these islands are still pretty low lying. But we haven't really tackled what is a megapode. So you know what they're related to and what their distribution is like, but megapodes themselves are quite interesting and unique birds. But first off, the word megapode stems from two Greek words, megas, which means great, or not like good as in great, but the original meaning of great, which is big or large, and podos for foot. So megapode, all in all, means great foot. And these birds are generally heavy-bodied, and many of the species are really poor flyers, although we do have some which are still fairly good flyers, and that's how they were able to disperse to these different islands. When we look at the species that exist today, there's not a huge amount of diversity in most of the genera that exist. So several of these genera, for example, Eulipoa, Macrocephalon, and Lipoa, so including the malleefowl, are only represented by single living individual species. So there's very limited diversity in these groups. And then both Talligella and Apipodius also have very limited diversity with only 2 to 3 living species. However, Megapodius, which is the species that you saw on the map before, is really diverse. And this is really driven by the fact that they were able to expand so rapidly across all of those Indo-Pacific islands, and the different groups that arrived on those islands diversified into individual species. And so alive today, we currently have 7 genera and around 21 species. And there's a few on here that you will recognise. So the malleefowl, of course, Lipoa ocellata. Megaponius rhinewort is the orange-footed scrubfowl, and this bird inhabits the northern part of Australia, and the Australian brush turkey, which is along the east coast. So as you can see, just by looking at these 3 species that are in Australia, there is a lot of diversity in this group because they all look fairly different. However, if we look at the skeletons of these birds, there are similarities which help us identify the fossil representatives. So just from fossils in Australia, we have 4 more genera. So that means that the existing diversity is only a small fraction of what has existed in the past. We can see that although there's 4 genera, there's 6 different species, and there's probably more over time. So Noapodius right down the bottom is from the Oligocene, as I mentioned before, the sort of 24 to 26 million years ago period. But then Progura and Latagallina are from much more recent times. And these are interesting birds because they also show increased diversity that we don't have represented today by these species. So, for example, Latagallina was quite different to other species, and so was Progura in their size. So general megapodes now are fairly small in size. For example, the Australian brush turkey, which is one of the larger species, is around 2.1 to 2.5 kilos, and the malleefowl is slightly smaller at around 1.8 to 2 kilos. However, the fossil species Progura gallinaceae is considered to have weighed upwards of about 7.7 kilos, so it is quite a bit larger. But all these birds have a really unique reproductive strategy, and that's one of the things that distinguishes them from other groups, because this type of strategy is really rare across birds. And the strategy is that they exploit environmental heat rather than relying on their own body heat to incubate their eggs. So they use heat sources such as geothermal activity in volcanic soils, solar radiation, or bacterial processes in decomposing organic matter. And they do this by using two main methods. So they either mound build or they burrow. And the choice is dependent on the type of substrate that's available where they are and the availability of these different heat sources as well. So, for example, the Australian brush turkey is well known for being a mound builder. Their mounds can be several metres in diameter, 2 to 4 metres in height, and contain about 5 tonnes of material. And that's still small compared to reports of 8-metre tall mounds in some other species, which might build a mound on top of an old mound. Now, mound building megapodes are considered to be amazing ecosystem engineers because they're moving so much of the resources in the environment around. And the malleefowl, which you'll hear more about later, is a great example of this, considering their environment is really limited in resources, so they have a large impact on the surrounding environment. But most of the time when we think about mound building megapodes, this type of incubation strategy generally occurs in ecosystems that have more ample vegetation, higher rainfall, and limited to no access to other sources of heat. And that's the type of environment that would favour mound building. Comparatively, burrow nesting is favoured in environments where there are other sources of heat, so volcanic soils and substrates in open spaces, which can be easily heated by the sun. Burrow nesters don't build a giant mound, but instead they burrow down into the naturally warmed sediments. So species like the Polynesian megapode dig really deep burrows up to about 1.5 metres in depth in the volcanically active areas across Polynesia, and they rely on this heat to incubate their eggs. Most species of megapode would select either one or the other. So the brush turkey will always mound build, and the mallee features here will always burrow. However, there are a few species of megapode which are in the genus Megapodius, again, that really diverse genus that I mentioned before, which are able to switch between the two strategies, depending on what they decide is the most effective and available heat source on generally whatever island they happen to be on or they end up on. So studies have assessed how this unusual type of incubation evolved in the megapodes. And what they found is that mound building is likely the ancestral type. So the first ever megapode would have had some form of mound building strategy. And then as that diversified, species of megapodes switched to be burrow nesting, as they came across appropriate soils and substrates. So the mound building process likely started with species covering up their eggs with a layer of leaves to protect their eggs from predators, which is seen in other ground nesting birds today. So it's not an unusual thing to happen, how it originated. It's just the extent to which they took this incubation strategy. And resultantly, they need to put in a lot more work because you can't just rely on your own body temperature. You have to really manage the mound to make sure that it is the right temperature for the eggs to progress, because too hot or not hot enough and the eggs won't develop or the chicks will die. So to function as an appropriate incubator, a mound, for example, is required to meet 3 conditions. It needs to have a critical mass of fresh litter, sufficient water content, and to have occasional mixing, which is the role of the adult malleefowl or the adult megapodes. And all of that influences the core temperature of the mound, in addition to mound size, ambient air temperature, the ability for the sediment to produce heat, and the thermal conductivity of the materials used as well. And then the megapodes will use the really sensitive parts of their head to test the temperature, and they make continual adjustments. And they're very accurate with this to make sure that they maintain the perfect temperature for their eggs. So resultantly, when the chicks leave the nest or the mound or the burrow, the megapode chicks are highly independent, and that's called precocial. So precocial means that the chicks are able to get up and walk around and generally look after themselves to some extent. But you see birds that are precocial, like the emu, just say, where they still need some form of parental care following hatching. Whereas megapodes are completely independent. The parents have 0 parental care responsibility when the chicks hatch, and the chicks have to be able to survive by themselves. So they can get up and walk around and feed themselves and fly pretty quickly after they've hatched and dug their way out of their mounds. And there's a lot of stages in the development of a chick which have adaptations to support this. So, for example, in the mound, there can be high carbon dioxide levels and less oxygen. So the parents will be looking after the sort of gas exchange in the mound, but also the eggs themselves have thin shells and large pores to manage this gas exchange. There's also a really large egg size, which is why they're often good as a food source. And they have a high yolk content, as well as really long incubation periods. So this all supports the development of the chick to make sure that they're able to survive once they hatch. So that brings me to the end of my talk, and I hope you learned a little bit about megapodes. Sorry if I was rushing through that a little bit. But now I think you're ready to hear some more interesting information specific to the malleefowl, and hopefully you've all signed up to volunteer to help find your own Bigfoot. Just a quick slide to say thank you, and of course lots of credits for the images that I used in this presentation and the research papers as well.
Wow, thank you, Phoebe. That was incredibly interesting. Does anybody have any questions? I haven't seen any pop up in the chat. I think you were just amazing, everybody. If anyone wants to just raise their hand if they've got a question.
I can take a breather.
No, I've got one. Do they have any ideas on why so many of the megapodes didn't make it through to now? Why there were so many that became extinct over time and we have so few in Australia now?
So there are some of the older species which have just sort of died out in the way that we see species turnover happening over millions of years. But then we do have species as well which would have overlapped with humans both in Australia and throughout the islands as well. So because they're pretty obvious when they're building a mound, they have great eggs. So there's a lot of different factors that would have influenced that, as well as just climate change. There's been a lot of changes throughout Australia, especially as our inland forests and then large freshwater inland systems have sort of disappeared over time, and that would have modified how much resources were in the environment. And we know that we used to have megapodes in Central Australia that were more adapted for quite a forested habitat as well. But of course, Central Australia is no longer forested. So, so a few different factors contributing to that.
They do look kind of large and tasty. I can see how that might have played a part. I've got a question from Chris. He's asking, does the adult tend to the nest all the way through until the young hatch and emerge and then duck off so they can't find their parents?
So I'm not sure about every species of megapode, but the nests do need to be looked after a lot because, throughout that entire period, they need to make sure that the gas exchange is properly managed, that it's the right temperature. So most of them do look after the mound for pretty much that entire time. And I've definitely seen videos where a parent's sort of tending to the mound and a chick comes out and it just completely ignores it. And the chick just gets up and walks away. So, yeah, I think, yeah.
Craig, do you have a comment for that?
So the other thing to remember with malleefowl, and I'm not sure how, I assume this applies to other megapodes as well, but they're linear sort of clutches in that they're like your backyard chooks. They lay eggs one after the other through the breeding season, and they need to maintain the conditions in the nest mound for all of those offspring. So in that sense, yes, they certainly do. They'll be tending the nest long after the earliest nestlings have left the mound.
Was there one video of an adult looking very shocked when a hatchling came out of the nest? I think I've seen something like that. Where did that come from?
I'll try and find that later. I haven't got it in my presentation, but if we've got time, I'll try and find that later. And
almost like
we can all have a giggle at it.
Yeah, that's minding my own business, tending this beautiful mound, and then this thing pops out. Okay, we've got a couple more here. I once saw a picture showing young malleefowl with just their heads poking out of the ground. I think it was a campground in Narcat. It didn't look right to me. Is there any truth to the image? Anyone know anything about that?
I mean, it's a lot of work for them to dig themselves out of these mounds. If it is true, it possibly was just taking a bit of a break, getting a breather.
Yeah. It is. I mean, what are they up to? Almost a metre deep when in the egg chamber. So it is a lot of work for them to get to the top, and that may well be something that somebody's managed to capture. Where that bird's got to the surface, and it may be not quite ready to pop out, and having a break.
Waiting for the helicopter parent to move on.
Yeah.
So it's safe to come out. All right, we do have a question here about introduced predators and herbivores, but I think that might be something you're going to cover, Craig, in your talk. So we might leave.
Thanks,
leave
Emma.
That one.
I'll cover that hopefully in some detail, and might be the topic of a bit of more of discussion later on, if you like.
Excellent.
We'll come back to that.
All right, I think we might be done with questions for now, so I will hand over to Craig.
Thanks, Sylvia, and thanks, Phoebe. That was absolutely fascinating. I think I love megapodes even more than I did before that talk. So you've done a great job, and their diversity is just amazing, and to think that they've evolved the ability to use geothermal energy to incubate their eggs is just fascinating. I've also got to start with a confession. As much as I'd like to accept my honorary doctorate now from Sylvia, I do not actually have a PhD. I'm just Mr. Craig. But maybe I can borrow yours, Sylvia, for Dr. Sylvia for tonight. Give me a bit more cred. I'm not even a malleefowl expert. I wouldn't say so anyway. But I have been involved in monitoring them and conserving them within our region for over 13 years now, and hopefully I'll be able to tell you a bit about what we've found from that monitoring and how that's influencing our management of them for their conservation in our region, and I'll talk a little bit about their role in the ecosystem and what their threats are and what their challenges are. So let's get into it, I guess. So now here we go, just getting things working. All right, so this is in grey, dark grey. You're seeing essentially the historical distribution of malleefowl within Australia. They're still found across 4 states. There may be some still in the territory. I'm not sure about that, but you can see on the map all the call-out arrows are pointing to the concentration of malleefowl monitoring sites across the 4 states where they're still found and monitored. Our region, which is down here in the Murraylands and Riverland, as you can see, has quite a heavy concentration of monitoring sites, and I do believe we have actually more monitoring sites than any other NRM region. We also have, if you were to go to the Atlas of Living Australia and do a search for malleefowl records, somewhere around half of the existing malleefowl records in the Atlas of Living Australia come from our region. So that's certainly in part a result of the bias that we have in monitoring effort and sampling effort, but I think it also demonstrates that it's essentially the best place in the world to see a malleefowl, and malleefowl are actually doing reasonably well by comparison in our region. So that's good news to start with. Most of what I'm going to tell you tonight has been written up in a summary of the work that we have done through a Australian government funded program on threatened mallee birds, conserving threatened mallee birds in our region over the past few years. And this report, I believe, should be available on our website if you want to read up in a bit more detail about what I'm going to present tonight. So that's a bit of a resource for you to have a look at in your own time. So how do we monitor malleefowl? Well, because malleefowl are so cryptic, they are well camouflaged by their colours and very quiet, slow movers in the environment. It's next to impossible to go out and physically count them. So we don't do direct surveys of their population numbers. We do it by visiting their mounds, which, as Phoebe pointed out, can be quite conspicuous, certainly when they are actively being used. And here you can see some of our volunteers monitoring the malleefowl mound in the Murraylands. Essentially, we do a search of a known habitat area to establish a sampling plot. We record the locations of the mounds that we've found in that area by GPS, and we go back every breeding season and to determine whether those nest mounds are being used, because the birds do reuse and renovate their nest mounds year after year. Sometimes they're abandoned for a period of time, a number of years, and then they may well come back and reuse old ones again. And so that's a reliable way of essentially looking at what is a proxy for their population size, to look at their breeding density. And over the long term, a change in the, especially a systematic change in the density of breeding mounds, or the proportion of breeding mounds, should be representative of their population. What you can see here is the results of malleefowl monitoring in our region over the 35 years that it's been happening, and you can see a very slight but definite decline in their populations over that period of time. So it is of concern, a species of conservation concern, and we're doing what we can to certainly to monitor that, but using that monitoring information and the evidence that it generates to guide us in how we manage them. If you look at the bars at the bottom, incidentally, that is the number of sites or monitoring sites included in the program increasing over time, and so we do believe that our results are actually becoming more reliable as we progress with our monitoring. Now, I just want to add at this point in time that this is one of the longest running and largest scale citizen science programs in the world. If you look at the geographical scale of it that I pointed out in the map before, and certainly the fact that it's been going on for 35 years and is almost entirely driven by volunteer input. And I can see some of our valuable and dedicated volunteers in the forum tonight. Welcome and thank you for everything you do. We couldn't protect malleefowl the way we do without you. Partly I'd like to celebrate that, I guess. Now, next slide. You'll see most of our malleefowl monitoring sites in our region. This is our Murraylands and Riverland region. Most of our monitoring sites are on this map. There are a few missing, and I've just excluded the ones that have not been monitored for the full period of the data set that I used to analyse for this report. So there's a scattering of sites that are missing from here. If anybody sees one that they regularly monitor and they don't know why it's missing, that's the reason. But if you look in the bottom here, I want to point out here that we've got two distinct zones of where malleefowl are found in our region, and that's important to note because it has an impact on what are the conditions that are very influential to malleefowl, and so local conditions are very important to their conservation and what impacts on their populations. Down here we've got essentially let's call it the agricultural zone. The orange, the sites are in orange down here. You've got much relatively higher rainfall, relatively more reliable rainfall, and more fertile soils, more productive ecosystems down in this part of the region. But consequently, it's also, as I said, it's the agricultural zone. So what you're seeing here is native vegetation cover in the olive green is far lower than it is up here in what we'll call tonight the pastoral zone, where native vegetation cover is almost continuous throughout that zone. So very fragmented in the south, but much more productive. In the north of the river, in the pastoral zone, much more continuous native vegetation cover, but more arid, less fertile soils, less reliable rainfall, less predictable rainfall, and sparser malleefowl populations. As you can see, that presents a number of different challenges for malleefowl. They're not, as Phoebe pointed out, they don't tend to be strong flyers, the megapodes. Malleefowl can fly quite well over short distances. In fact, they're a bit like a missile. I've seen them shoot across the bow of my four-wheel drive as I've scared one from the one side of the track to the other. But you do rarely see them on the wing, and when they do, it's their sort of explosive escape from a threat that sends them flying. And so their dispersal in this southern agricultural zone is going to be limited by that fragmentation of the habitat. I'm going to move on because I'll go down a rabbit hole. Let's have a look at a slice of the more recent data and have a look at what affects malleefowl breeding activity. And what this is showing us here is that in both of those zones, despite the differences in the conditions for malleefowl, their breeding effort, which is the red sort of curve here and here, is strongly associated or follows the annual rainfall totals for each of those regions. And the graphs down the bottom just simply demonstrate that most of the variation in that breeding activity is strongly associated with that rainfall. Now, why is that? Well, Phoebe did point out that they do rely on a certain amount of moisture in the soil to provide the conditions under which their eggs will be reliably incubated. So they're essentially building a big compost heap. If your compost heap at home is dry, not much composting and decomposition actually happens, and that's what generates the heat, in large part anyway, to incubate their eggs. Rainfall obviously is also directly proportional, or in reverse, the growth of vegetation, which is a major part of the food or diet for malleefowl, is directly proportional to seasonal rainfall, and so that's an important factor as well, and we'll talk about that a bit more as we go ahead. So food availability and the conditions for incubating eggs. Don't forget that that vegetation that's growing in response to the rainfall is also what they're using to compost in their mounds. So what is it that is causing malleefowl to decline? Well, this is like a mind map, if you like, that's been put together by expert elicitation. It's a conceptual model of all the things that malleefowl experts, the real ones, have believe affect malleefowls in one way or another, directly or indirectly. Typically, if you ask the person in the street, you're going to see this kind of common perception that things like fire, introduced predators, certainly have a negative effect on malleefowl, and they're often blamed as the most important factors. We're beginning to find with our from our results that that's not necessarily the case. But I will say at this point, and I think we do need to remember that local context, as I said earlier about the two zones, other factors as well really do influence this and the local unique local context is very important. So moving on, foxes certainly do have an impact on malleefowl populations, or certainly on malleefowl individuals. We know that they have an impact on malleefowl by predation at all stages of the malleefowl life cycle. They dig up the eggs, they nab the nestlings as they leave the mound, and they also chase down and take the adult birds. So that's a given. What we're finding, however, is that that is certainly not commonly the most common or the most important and influential factor moderating their populations. And how do we know this? Well, we've joined a new aspect of the National Malleefowl Monitoring Program, which is the Adaptive Management Predator Experiment. And that's essentially designed to test across the country, across the distribution of malleefowl nationally, what is the relationship between efforts to control predators, predator activity itself, and malleefowl breeding effort, being the proxy for their population numbers. So how we do that? Well, where we have our sampling plots, we also have installed surveillance cameras, looking not at the mounds themselves, but at the general habitat. We've selected plots that have a gradient of intensity of predator control effort, so essentially fox baiting effort, within the same kinds of habitats, within the same landscape, so that we can look at what are the differences in fox activity according to the differences in fox baiting effort, and what are the differences then that flow on or may flow on in malleefowl activity. So let's have a look at that data and see what it looks like. Now, just before I move on, I want to point out that also is entirely driven by volunteers. We have volunteers who kindly go out and service the cameras for us and retrieve the images and change the batteries. We then process that data by putting it up onto this website here. It's Wildlife Spotter. I think you can certainly find a link to this on our website. Wildlife Spotter is a platform whereby volunteers can join in online from home, look at the photographs that we capture in our camera traps, and turn them into data for us so that we can actually get these results. So what do the results look like? Foxes certainly are up there amongst the most common things found on our cameras. They're roughly about a double the number we get of malleefowl, but this Empire State column here is kangaroos, and I think that that certainly results from the way kangaroos move through the environment, but I think it tells a story in itself. Just in this graph, showing that we get sort of 3 times more kangaroos than anything else, basically, and there's that certainly has a relationship with that food availability and habitat quality factor for malleefowl. How does this compare across sites? How do the results compare across sites? Well, if we look at this plot, this compares in blue fox activity, and in the maroon is malleefowl activity. The first 3 sites on this plot are in the agricultural zone, and as I said, the massive difference you're seeing in the numbers here is primarily due to the productivity of the ecosystems. All boats rise on the tide, and we have, as I said, much more productive ecosystems in the agricultural zone, and that's why we get more activity in both of these species categories. The last 3 on the right are in the pastoral zone. And as you can see, correspondingly lower levels of activity. But let's look now at how they compare. There isn't much of a difference between these 3 sites in the agricultural zone in terms of the fox baiting effort that goes in to these areas. If anything, Bakara Conservation Park probably has slightly less fox baiting effort in the area than does either of these other 2 sites. It also is the lowest in terms of fox activity out of those sites. So just put a marker on that for now, and we'll have a closer look at the pastoral zone. The most intensive fox baiting activity or effort we go to in our region is in Gluepot. Cowpram has a slightly more than half the intensity of fox baiting effort there, and in Dangali we do no fox baiting at all, and have not done throughout the life of this study, but we have decreasing fox activity in that direction. Less noticeable, but certainly there is a difference. To point out here is that where we have the least fox baiting activity in the pastoral zone, we also have, out of those pastoral sites, the most malleefowl activity. So interesting stuff there, and I think at least most people, I think, would agree, and somewhat counterintuitive, if you assume that foxes are an important factor. So that's doesn't seem to be what the data is telling us. Here you can see fox activity over time. Again, what this is just showing us is in both of those zones, if you remember back to the rainfall curves, these peaks in activity are essentially just following that resource curve. More rainfall, more prey animals, more foxes. When the weather dries out, the numbers return and to a sort of a fluctuation with seasonal conditions. Certainly, the analysis of the 35 years of data that we have, alongside environmental monitoring and measurements, and the data that's now coming in from the adaptive management predator experiment. It's been presented in this paper, in which they do point out, the researchers point out that certainly rainfall is a much more important factor in influencing malleefowl breeding activity, and we believe that that is strongly associated with herbivore activity, correlates with what we're seeing in the numbers of kangaroos, and certainly you would have seen hares are a big contributor to our camera trapping results as well. So what are we doing about this? We're trying to control herbivores. They're directly competing with malleefowl for food, and they're also eating malleefowl habitat, which, by the way, is what largely protects them through their camouflage and their cryptic behaviour from these predators anyway. So in the pastoral zone, one of the big, most important activities we're undertaking is closing these old pastoral dams, which are redundant now, removing that water, that standing water from the landscape, allowing it to soak in and water the vegetation rather than evaporate in the dams, and importantly, removing that drinking water for the herbivores. I can see you shuffling, Sylvia. I'm finishing up. So we're reducing the numbers of herbivores by making the landscape less able to support them, and trying to get certainly feral goats under control by that means, and reducing the elevated populations of kangaroos as well. And here's an example of where we closed this Little Oak Dam, I think this one is, back in 2018. We had very good rainfall. That's a couple of months later when it was freshly closed. And then this is about 2 years later after we had good rainfall in the ensuing couple of years. And certainly you would not have seen this amount of cover of vegetation if we had not removed the water. That is not planted. That is just grown on its own. And it's quite a diverse stand of native vegetation. So we're doing that. We are, as ever, we're controlling rabbits, and we're trying to take a landscape scale approach to dealing with kangaroos. I want to look at. I won't go on for too long about monitoring scale, but we've got improvements in technology now, allowing us to monitor, set up monitoring at a larger scale using LiDAR. I think that's the way we need to go further up north in that pastoral landscape, and I want to also just highlight a couple of other research efforts that have come out of the camera trapping in particular. Phoebe mentioned malleefowl as an important ecosystem engineer. Certainly they do. You talked about the amount of soil that they turn over. This paper explains how we've compared the camera trapping data from this project with camera trapping on actual mounds, and it demonstrates that the actual mounds themselves also provide change the way other fauna use the habitat. It becomes a perching and foraging vantage point for predatory birds. It's a basking sort of space for reptiles and many other things. This is also a study into the soil differences, soil ecology and soil biochemistry differences between areas with malleefowl mounds and areas without. And that's sort of come out of this monitoring effort as well. And it really points out an important role that malleefowl have, ever more so now that we largely do not have any more the many fossorial mammals. I mean, essentially the echidna is probably the only one that's still widely found in these landscapes that turn over that soil and encourage plant growth.
Really it.
What else? What else aids malleefowl? And what I think they have a what's the word? Symbiotic, let's say, relationship with volunteers. So while we have citizen scientists like these people working hard in our landscape, I think malleefowl are certainly also doing well. And again, I'd like to say in closing, thank you for all your efforts that go into malleefowl monitoring in the region, and please come out and get involved. And Chris will tell you how directly.
Thank you, Craig. Yes, just before we get into questions, because we're just on time now, in case anyone needs to run away, I might just ask Chris to quickly just introduce himself and the opportunities that are available now and into the future, and then we'll jump into the questions.
Yep. Howdy, everyone. Good to see you again. Thanks so much, everyone involved, particularly Phoebe and Craig, and for everyone tuning in. With regards to malleefowl monitoring, obviously Craig's painted a picture of how amazing and integral volunteers are in this process. What we've set up on the Murraylands and Riverlands Landscape Board webpage is a malleefowl flow page, which you'll learn a little bit about malleefowls. Obviously, you already know lots and have learned a bit more tonight, but you'll also have an opportunity there to learn about the volunteering sites and times that malleefowl monitoring will be occurring. So it'll be great. Obviously, some of you that are present today are already involved. For those of you that aren't and are interested, please have a look, or please share the opportunity with others as well. And what I'll do is, there we go, Sylvia's put it up, which is magic. That's just click on that link. It'll take you to the flow page, and it will tell you about the available opportunities. Monitoring will be occurring early October all the way through until late November, early December. I'll be involved with all the volunteers. So have a look at that. If you have any questions at all or challenges, please get in contact. Thanks again. Thanks for tuning in.
Thanks, Chris. And we will email out all of these links and links to the papers and things as well, if people are interested, which I hope you are. Okay, on to some questions. So we have, there was a question about malleefowl on the York Peninsula, whether they're in Warrenben and Innes. And then we had Emma from Department of Environment and Water, who has responded to that question saying, yes, lots in Innes and probably in Warrenben too. Thank you. That question's already answered. Right. The next question was, what are the main food sources for the adult malleefowl? Craig, do you want to take that one?
It's quite diverse. They rely heavily on ephemeral green foliage, grasses, herbs, and freshly growing shoots during that period before the breeding season to build up their energy levels, to get them through the breeding season. And one of the things that we've found is that in the absence of that kind of growth during that period, they just don't even bother setting up their mounds to breed for that season. And the other thing to point out is it's those growing shoots, but it's also the reproductive parts of the plants, the flowers, the buds, the fruits and seeds are all part of their diet. And while we've got a certain level of herbivory going on in the landscape, that's an important process to our ecology. But if it's too high, essentially that green fresh growth is the first thing that gets nibbled off. by goats and kangaroos, and so that's what malleefowl miss out on because of the grazing pressure. But yeah, they certainly do take there'll be insect life in their diet. They're a generalist. They're chooks, so they'll eat whatever they can find, but they're largely they're really responsive to the amount of green plant matter that's
Like
in
the
the landscape, and so that's what they rely on. Yeah.
Excellent. Got another question linked with that one. Helga's asking if you think that the collapse of the insect populations might be another cause of decline, especially for chicks who might need extra protein.
Yeah, that's important for all bird life, pretty much. Or much of it anyway. That protein availability through insects, and obviously there are insectivorous birds that primarily rely on the insect populations and the diversity, as well as the sheer volume of that, and they are not coincidentally among our most threatened birds, and certainly the malleefowl is by no means the most threatened mallee bird that we have. We've got a handful of them that are in more dire straits than the malleefowl. So I think there's a big contribution by that factor. I will point out though that largely or in large part, that insect population and diversity is reliant also on the vegetation that we have or don't have. So, it starts with the plants. I think certainly that's what we're seeing in the data. I would like to get to a point where we're no longer as worried about the plants, and maybe we do see a stronger signal coming from insects. But I think there might be, as I said, some sort of there's a parallel relationship there. So I think that's part of it. Yeah.
Thank you. All right, we've got one last question here. So this is again from Helga. She says, in her experience, malleefowl hang on better south of the river than north, even over small distances. For example, comparing Gluepot to Murray Sunset. Do you have any ideas on why this might be?
Helga, what do you mean by hang on?
Helga, do you want to jump on? Still there?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah. How you going?
Oh, hang on. Just that I used to see them in Gluepot, but not anymore. But I still see them, all that tracks, quite regularly just south of the river. Just better numbers.
Okay. Yeah. I touched briefly on the scale that we monitor malleefowl, particularly north of the river. I think we're monitoring them at the wrong scale there. One of the things you'll read about in the report that I showed you earlier is that we've actually got a big plot. Most of the plots are only 2 or 4 square kilometres in size, but we've got a big one now up in Dangali that's 100 square kilometres, and it has recorded, since it was established a few years ago, every single year since then, more active mounds in that one plot than in all the other plots across that entire landscape combined. And I think there's a story in that. And my feeling is that because of that continuity of habitat, or at least native vegetation cover, even if it's not all suitable habitat for malleefowl in that landscape, dispersal is more achievable for malleefowl between different sites where the conditions may or may not be suitable for them to breed. And so we do know that they do move around. So I think they're more able to move around north of the landscape, in the northern landscape. but I think they're also more likely to do so because of the less reliable landscape scale rainfall events. You can have some areas of that landscape that have received quite good rainfall over a period of a year, and other areas where it's dry. And I think my feeling is that malleefowl are probably breeding more prolifically and are using that landscape more securely in some way than our monitoring is currently showing us. And so I think that those differences you might see in a local area like Glue Pot or any local area might actually be more to do with the movement of the birds around that landscape than an overall landscape scale trend in their population numbers. That's my feeling, and I think we won't really know that until we do change the scale that we monitor them. So whereas as opposed to that agricultural zone down the south where it's harder for them to disperse and move around, and they don't necessarily have to as much. So that might be, I think, the reason why you're seeing a difference in across those two landscapes. Helga, what do you think?
Okay. Thanks, Craig.
All right, thank you, everybody. We'll call it there. We're a few minutes over. So big thank you to everyone that joined us. Big thank you to Dr. Phoebe, Dr. Carl, Dr. Chris, Dr. Alice, and everyone else can have an honorary malleefowl doctorate as well for joining in. I'm sure you've got enough of malleefowl information in your brain now to get one. So thank you all. And yes, we'll email everyone all the details on how you can get involved. And thank you so much to all the people who are online who are already involved.